Masechet Gittin Daf Ayin Aleph. We're continuing the discussion from the Mishnah about a deaf person giving a get. We're going to distinguish today between someone who cannot hear and a mute person who cannot speak. So here we go. Amarav Kahana Amarav Cheresh she'achol ledaber mitoch haketav kotvin venotnin get leishto. Rav Kahana, in the name of Rav, comes and has a big chidush that someone who is deaf can, but he knows how to communicate through writing. He can read and write, so he can write a directive to that people should write a get and give it to his wife, and that will be valid. That's Rav's chidush. Amar Rav Yosef, my kamash ma'lan. Says, what is Rav Kahana in the name of Rav teaching us here? Don't we know that? Can we figure this out by ourselves from our Mishnah? Tenena nishtatek v'amru lo nichtov get lishtecha hirkin berosho bodkin oto shlosha pa'amim im amar alav lav. Our Mishnah taught that if someone became a mute, he could still hear, but he can't speak. So he can't say, write a get for my wife. If we ask him, should we write a get for your wife? And he nods his head, we check him 3 times. And if he says, for no questions, he says no. For yes questions, he says yes. Then we know that he is competent and we write it for him. So if he can communicate through nodding and we write a get, all the more so we should write a get for someone who can write, because that's even more explicit. He can actually write out a sentence. That's a better sign of his mental competence than nodding. So can we figure that out from the Mishnah itself? Rav Kahana, what are you adding that we couldn't figure out ourselves? Amar le Rabbi Zera, ilem ka'amart. So Rabbi Zera tells Rav Yosef, wait a second, you're comparing 2 different things. You want to try to bring a proof from a mute, right? In our Mishnah, obviously you can hear because we test them out, right? We say, do you want watermelon in the winter? Right? We ask him questions. So obviously he can hear, he just can't speak. So that's a different story than Haresh. Shane ilem detanya medaber ve'no shomea zehu Haresh. Shomea ve'no medaber ze ilem. Veze vaze hareh kifikchin lechol divrehem. So we're actually going to have 3 different categories. One is someone who can speak but cannot hear. That's called cheresh. The other way around, he can hear but he cannot speak. That's ilem. So listen, someone who can hear, he has some kind of voice issue and he can't speak. So if he can hear, he can understand everything. So obviously that person is like a pikeach, is like a mentally competent person for all matters. It's just that he can't voice it. So that's what our Mishnah is talking about. He can hear, he just can't say, write a get for my wife. So as long as he can nod, that's just fine. You cannot compare that to that Rav statement. Rav was talking about Haresh who cannot hear or speak. Now in this Baraita, it says if someone has one or the other, is like a pikeach, whether he can speak and not hear, or hear but cannot speak. Both of those are like a pikeach. Whereas Rav's statement was someone who can cheresh totally, who cannot hear and cannot speak, but can write. So that's his chidush, right? You wouldn't necessarily know that from the fact that a mute can nod does not necessarily mean that a deaf mute can write. So that's why he has to say that chidush. How do you know that these words mean what you just said that they mean? Because look at this pasuk in Tehillim, it says, I am like Haresh, I cannot hear. So Haresh is someone who can speak but not hear. Also, someone who can't do either is also called Cheresh, right? But Cheresh means can't hear, whether they can speak or not. Whereas Ilem, right, I cannot open my mouth. So an Ilem is someone who cannot speak. Or another one is from a folk etymology that people say his speech has been taken from him. And if you take the Ilem, right, you see the Aleph here and the Lamed and the Mem, so you get a concatenation of these words, spells out Ilem. Rabbi Zera therefore rejected Rav Yosef's question about Rav Kahana by distinguishing between Ilem and Haresh. But now Rabbi Zera says, I have my own question against Rav Kahana in the name of Rav. אמר רבי זרעי קשיא לי הקשיא לי דתניא. אם לא יגיד, פרט לאילם שאינו יכול להגיד. עמי היכול להגיד מתוך הכתב. He quotes a braita that says, this is a pasuk that says, if a person knows testimony about someone else's monetary claim and refuses to testify, then that's a sin. They have to bring a special korban. So the Midrash says, Im lo yagid, if he does not say the testimony, then he is liable. But that excludes someone who is mute, because he cannot speak. He is not liable, even if he knows testimony and he doesn't say it. Well, he can say it, and so therefore he is not liable. Now we ask about that. According to you, Rav Kanan, in the name of Rav, you said that a mute can write something and say, he can write a directive. And we accept that as his will. So if a mute person, we accept his writing, then over here, how come a mute person is not liable? He can write out his testimony, and that there would be valid testimony, and therefore if he refuses to write his testimony, he should be liable. That's his question. Amar l'Abaye, Aidut ka'amart, shana Aidut Rachamana amar mipihem velo mipi ketavam. Abaye says, no, you're talking about testimony. That's different. Regarding testimony, the Torah says, mipihem, you have to hear from the mouths of the witnesses and not from their writing. If a witness has written notes about, written deposition, that's not acceptable in court. A witness is permitted to consult notes. Let's say they took notes at the time to remember. They can look at their notes, but they have to say their testimony orally. Otherwise, it's not acceptable. That's different from a legal directive. When the husband is saying, I want you to write a get for my wife, that is permitted in writing. So that's the difference between the two. Okay, good. Next question, Metibe. Keshem shebodkin oto legitin, kach bodkin oto lemasaot umatanot uleduyot ve'lirshiot katanemihat eduyot. We have a Tosefta that says, just like we check someone regarding a get, if someone is a mute, so we check if they know how to nod and shake their head, yes and no. So we can also use the same process and use their head gestures regarding business transactions or giving gifts or eduyot, testimonies, or for inheritances. So among this list is in fact testimony. So this is a challenge to Abaye. Abaye said that testimony has to be oral, cannot be written. But here it says that you can have testimony even if it's just nodding one's head, right? Did you see him on this day? Yes, I saw him. So it sounds like you don't have to verbally express testimony. It can be done in non-verbal ways. That's the question. No, in this Tosefta, when it says testimony, not talking about general testimony, only testimony that a woman's husband has died so that she can get remarried. There we ask him yes or no questions, and said, did you see this husband and he was dead? Yes, I saw he was dead. For that, the sages were lenient because we don't want an aguna. We want to be able to allow the woman to remarry even if there are not two full-fledged witnesses. So that's the only time it's allowed, but not in general. Okay, v'hakatani yerushot, but also says yerushot. Doesn't that mean that he's testifying about a certain inheritance of another person? That, yeah, I know that this person inherited that thing. Amar Rabbi Abhu, yerushat ben ha-bechor. It says, no, it's not talking about testimony for other people. It's talking about his own firstborn. So it's not testimony, but rather it's expressing his legal will, right? A person can say, I don't want my bechor to get double. I want my bechor to get less than that, more than that. So he can do that by nodding, because that's not testimony, rather an expression of legal will. So that would be the same as a get, where it's not testimony, but giving a legal directive. Katan miet l'masaot u'matanot, my love la'alma. On the list it also says business transactions and gifts. Gifts. Isn't that talking about testimony on behalf of somebody else that is testifying, yes, I saw this person sell that land to that person. I saw him give the gift of this horse to that person. Isn't it talking about that? No, it's talking about for himself. He's not saying it as testimony, but rather he's as either a litigant or he's actually making a transaction. He says, are you sure you want to give this away as a gift? He says, yes, I want to give it as a gift. Right? Do you want to give that thing? No, I don't want to. So therefore, we were able to explain everything in this Baraita. to mean legal directives and not testimony. And so that answers all the questions. Someone who cannot, testimony has to be verbal, oral. Another question. Haresh lo alchu bo achar mizotav, achar kefisotav, achar ketav yado, ela b'metaltelin aval lo legitin. This question goes back to Rav Kahana's statement. Rav Kahana, who said that a deaf person can write a directive to give a get, but in this baraita says a deaf person, we do not follow their movement, their lip movements, or their hand gestures, or their handwriting, except for buying and selling movable objects, but not for divorce. So here you see it says clearly signals, movements, handwriting, that's the key one for us, is okay for buying and selling, but is not good for a get. This directly contradicts Rav Kahana in the name of Rav, who says that a deaf person can write a legal directive to divorce his wife. So the answer is Tana'ehi. In fact, there are different baraitot. You're right, this baraita says it's no good, but we have another baraita, another opinion among the Tana'im. There's a continuation of that baraita that says it is allowed. The Tanyamar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Bameh divim amorim becharesh mikaro. Aval pikech v'nitcharesh hu kotev v'hen chotmin. So when do we say that? Right, he's giving a different opinion. When is it true that you cannot give a written directive for a get? That's only if the person was deaf from the time he was born. But if he was hearing and he became deaf, then he can write, and he'll write the get or instructions to the get, and other people will come and sign it, and that's perfectly fine. What's the difference? Well, if a person was able to hear, so he got an education and he heard everything, and later on he became deaf, but he doesn't lose his mind because he became deaf. He can't hear anymore, but he's legally competent, mentally competent. Whereas if someone was born deaf and they didn't have the educational systems that we have today to teach deaf people, so then they would never have learned language in the first place, and without learning language, they would not be able to form thoughts in an ordered way sufficiently to be responsible for giving a get. So that is the difference. So you see anyway that according to Rashbag, if a person, he agrees that if a person was always deaf, then that's a problem. But if a person became deaf, then they could write a get, and that could be what Rav Kahana, the name of Rav, is talking about that very case. And now we ask, wait, really? If a deaf person was always deaf, then he can't write a directive? This is quoting a Mishnah in Masechet Yevamot that says just like a deaf person can get married using gestures, so too he can divorce her using gestures. So we see that, and this is talking about a deaf person who was deaf at the time that he got married, and he's deaf at the time of divorce. So he's always deaf, and yet he can divorce. He can divorce with a gesture. So that sounds like he can even if he was deaf his entire life. So we answer, now if he's talking about his wife, then indeed that's true. What's the difference? So if a person was, let's say he was deaf his whole life, it doesn't really have to be his whole life. It could be that the point is that he's deaf when he got married and when he got divorced. In that case, a deaf person cannot actually get married midoraita. He doesn't have da'at to do the act of kiddushin. However, the rabbis wanted it to be possible for a deaf person to have a happy life together with a woman. So they made it a kiddushin midrabanan. They're married midrabanan. Since the marriage, the kiddushin, is only midrabanan, therefore the rabbis also made a get midrabanan. So therefore, since he was deaf the whole time, he could enter into it midrabanan, and as long as he makes a signal, he can get out of it also midrabanan. That's what it's talking about. Ibish tochinami. But what are we talking about here up above when it says that a deaf person cannot divorce? If he was deaf his whole life, that's talking about a case of yibum. How would that work? You have a deaf man. He was deaf his whole life. His brother was married, fully married, midoraita. His brother died without children. So now the Yevama falls to him. If he performs Yibum, he is fully married. The deaf living brother is fully married, midoraita, because for Yibum you don't need Kiddushin. You don't need an act of da'at. It's just the act of yibum, the act of bi'ah will make them fully married mid-deoraita. So that's what this baraita here is talking about. That if he was deaf his whole life, he cannot sign that he wants a divorce because the marriage is mid-deoraita, because it's yibum. But you're right. In fact, if they were married when he was deaf with kiddushin, then he can do a derabanan divorce also, birmiza. Yivim tomiman. So now we just want to clarify this case. So how exactly who passed the wife along to him in this case of Yibum? Were both brothers deaf? I mean, they are related, so maybe it's genetic. In that case, there would be no problem, because just like the first brother, since he was deaf, he entered into his marriage midrabanan. So when he dies, she is only a yevama midrabanan. So the yibum is drabanan. Therefore, he would be able to divorce her birmiza, because it's all drabanan. So then it wouldn't be a problem. Rather, it has to be talking about where the brother was hearing, the one who died. Since he was hearing, his marriage is deoraita. She is yevama medeoraita. When the brother dies, when they are together, so that's yibum deoraita. So that's a case where he won't be able to divorce her birmiza, and that's what this baraita up here was talking about. Okay, so that has to be the case. That's one possibility. Or maybe it actually could be that the brother was cheresh. Ugzera achiv cheresh atu achiv pikeach, and maybe we'll make a gezerah. Listen, technically, since the brother who died was cheresh, his marriage was only midrabanan, and therefore, when he dies, it's only yibum drabanan. So really, meikaradin, the yavam should be able to give her a get midrabanan. But if you allow that case, someone will think, oh, I guess it's okay in all cases, and will permit it even when the brother who dies is hearing. But that's not true. So since it's difficult to distinguish between the two, that's why the rabbis said across the board, no deaf person who received the yevama can divorce her. Okay, now we say, wait a second. If once you're making a gezerah, why don't you make a gezerah against his wife also? In other words, if a person is cheresh and he marries when he's cheresh and then wants to divorce when he's cheresh, even though meikar adina should be fine because the marriage is d'Rabbanan, so we can allow the divorce b'Rabbanan, but you should say we'll make a gezerah. If you allow that, then you may come to allow also yibum when the brother was hearing, and that yibum makes a marriage midoraita. So let's prohibit a cheresh from giving a wife, even for giving a get, even for his wife when he married her, when he was cheresh the whole time, because then we might come to permit when it's a case of yibum, and that's a marriage midoraita. So why don't we say that? The answer is one case of yibum to another case of yibum. People will get confused, right? They're not going to be so careful to distinguish. Oh, well, in this case of yibum, the brother was also deaf, therefore it's okay. But when the brother who died is hearing, then it should not be okay. That's confusing. But people are not going to confuse a case of a marriage versus a case of yibum, and therefore there's no problem with that, and we can stick with the Mishnah, right? This is why we have to say that it's permitted, because the Mishnah itself said, just like yes, if he's deaf the whole time, he can marry her midrabanan and divorce her midrabanan, and we're not going to come to confuse that with a case of yibum, right? Yibum is different, since yibum, if the original marriage was deoraita, then the yibum is also going to be mid-deoraita. All right, good. Now, migazin cheresh atu pikeach. Wait, now back to the two yevama cases. do we really make a gezerah of a deaf person to a competent person? That means the brother who died, we're not going to allow it when he is deaf because we may come to confuse it when the person who died is hearing. Is that true? Look in the following Mishnah, you see we do not make a gezerah. Another Mishnah from Masechet Yevamot, Vatanan. שני אחים חרשים נשואים שתי אחיות פיקחות, או שני אחיות חרשות, או שני אחיות אחת פיקחת ואחת חרשת. That's the first half of the Mishnah. If you have two brothers who are both deaf, and they are married to any two sisters, and see, it doesn't really matter what the sisters are, whether the sisters are both hearing, or both deaf, or one and one. That's one set of cases. Or v'chen shte achayot chershot nesuot shne achim pikchin. Or the two women, the two wives who are also sisters, are deaf and they're married to two men, two brothers, and it doesn't really matter what the brothers are. Either they're both hearing, or l'shne achin chershin, or l'shne achin echad pikach ve'echad cheresh, or they're both deaf, or one and one. In all these cases, elu piturot min chalisa umin hayibum. You don't have to do chalisa, and you don't even have to do yibum either. Let's explain this case. Let's say everybody was hearing. Let's start with a simple case. Two brothers married to two sisters. That's permitted. Two brothers are allowed to marry two sisters. Here's the thing. If one of those brothers dies without children, then the living brother is not permitted to do yibum because that is his wife's sister. That's arva. Not permitted to marry your wife's sister as long as both sisters are still alive. And therefore, just like in any case where the yavam has an arva relationship with the yavama, you don't do yibum and you don't even need to do chalisa. That's the simple case. The chidush here is that even when any of them are cheresh, and if either the husband or the wife is cheresh, that marriage is only midrabanan. And so therefore, that prohibition against the sister-in-law, the wife's sister, is only going to be midrabanan. The chidush of this Mishnah is that even though that marriage is only midrabanan, and then therefore the isur erva is only midrabanan, nevertheless, that isur midrabanan makes it impossible to do yibum, and since you can't do yibum, you don't even need to do chalisa at all. Okay, that's the first part of the Mishnah. Now, if they were not related, and this happened, the wives were not related, well then they can do yibum because it's not his wife's sister, so you can do yibum. After you do yibum, even if the brother is deaf, even if the yavam is deaf, if he wants to divorce her, he can divorce her. Why? Because we're talking about a case where both brothers were deaf, or both women were deaf. Either way, the original all the marriages are midrabanan, and since the marriage of the brother who died was dirabanan, because either he's deaf or his wife is deaf, therefore, when that brother dies without children, the yibum is only midrabanan. So, since the yibum is only midrabanan, they're only married. The yavam and the yavam are only married midrabanan. Therefore, he can divorce her midrabanan. Okay, that's the Mishnah. What's the point? We see from this Mishnah that we do not make a gezerah. We do not say that, if both brothers are deaf, or both wives, or whatever, if someone is deaf in each marriage, then it's derabanan. We do not say, well, technically that would be okay because it's all derabanan, but maybe we should make a gezerah, because then you'll confuse it with a case where the brother who died was hearing and his wife was also hearing, and if that was a deoraita marriage, then it would be bum deoraita. If it was bum deoraita, then the yavam who was deaf would not be able to divorce her, because he can only act midrabanan and would not be able to give a get midoraita. We don't say that we make a gezerah to that case. Instead, we say it's totally fine. So therefore, you see that we do not make a gezerah. Ela machvarta gedashaninan meikara. Therefore, we're going to forget about the second possibility, the second answer, that is because of a gezerah. We're going to go back to the first answer, that the prohibition, when can a yavam who's cheresh when can he not divorce the yavama? only in the case where his brother was hearing, the one who died, in which case the yibum is deoraita, so he can't get out of it. But if both brothers were cheresh, then in fact he would be able to give a divorce. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, chalukin alav chaberav al Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Okay, we just saw Rashbag. He says that someone who's cheresh can give written instructions to divorce his wife. That's permitted. That's in agreement with Rav Kahana in the name of Rav. Rabbi Yochanan, however, says Rashbag is a minority opinion, and the sages disagree with him. Good. Amar Abaye, afana name tenena nishtatit velo yosi nitcharesh hu o nishtata lo yosi olamit. My olamit lava fagav deyachol ledaber mitoch haketav. Abaye says, I have proof that, in fact, Rashbag is a minority opinion, because look at this Mishnah in Yevamot, in which we're going to prove that a deaf person cannot divorce in writing. So let's see, it doesn't say it explicitly. We have to derive it. This Mishnah says that if a woman becomes insane, she cannot be divorced. We're going to see the reason for this is that even though technically a woman can receive a divorce against her will, and therefore she doesn't have to have mental competence to get divorced, this is a rabbinic protection for her sake, because if a man is allowed to divorce his mentally incapacitated wife, then what is she going to do? Who's going to take care of her? She'll be taken advantage of. She'll be abused. So to protect her, we say, listen, you married her, great, you have to take care of her, you cannot divorce her. Okay, that's what it says, lo yotzi. And the other case is if him, nitchareshu or nishtata, lo yotzi olamit. If a husband, he got married when he was totally fine, and he became deaf or he became insane, then he has no way to give a get, because he has a full deoraita marriage, and there's no way that he can initiate a divorce. And here it says olamit. The first case doesn't say olamit, but here it says olamit. So he says, why olamit? What is this added word? Doesn't that mean that even if he can speak by writing, even if he's able to communicate by writing, still he can't? Olamit is like not at all, no way. And so this proves that a person who became deaf, even if he can write, still cannot get divorced. So you see that this contradicts Rashbag, contradicts Rav Kahana in the name of Rav. And this therefore supports Rabbi Yochanan that the majority, other sages, disagree with Rashbag and say you cannot write a directive. Amar Papa, ilav dashmuinan Rabbi Yochanan hava amina Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel lefarushet tamad detanakama hu da'ata umay olamit afagav dechazena le deharif. Rav Papa says that baraita is not necessarily a proof for what Rabbi Yochanan said. And in fact, if Rabbi Yochanan had not said that the Rashbag disagrees with the Tanakama, I could have read it differently, that Rashbag is actually explaining what Tanakama said, and they all agree. And how else could you explain the word olamit? That even if you see that the person is sharp-witted and he knows what's going on, nevertheless, if he only does hand gestures or head gestures, that would not be sufficient for him to get divorced. Because we're talking here about a cheresh. Our Mishnah was talking about someone who can hear, but he just can't speak. There, we said nodding is fine. So the word olamit here is giving us the chidush that even though he's able to gesture and nod just fine, but that's not good enough. Sorry, even though we see he's sharp, he can't give a directive by gestures. However, he could give a directive through writing. And so, you know what? If not for the Rabbi Yochanan, I could have interpreted this Mishnah to be in agreement with Rashbag. Or another way, I could also interpret it to be in agreement with Rashbag is as follows: Ina melech Rabbi Yitzchak, Tamar Rabbi Yitzchak, Davar Torah shota mitgareshet, midi dehava pikachat be'al korcha. Uma tam amru ena mitgareshet shelo yinhagu ba minhag hefker. Or we use what Rabbi Yitzchak said, that I already anticipated Rabbi Yitzchak, that according to the letter of law midoraita, a insane woman can be divorced, just like a sane woman who can get divorced against her will. She doesn't have to do anything. She could just be be sitting there, she could be sleeping. As long as the get goes into her domain, she is divorced. So she doesn't need any mind to be divorced. So what's the reason that the rabbi said that a husband cannot divorce his wife who becomes a shotah, so that others will not treat her abusively? Okay, so that the first clause is on the Rabbanan. Therefore, when the Baraita Mishnah says Olamit in the second clause, Olamit is emphasizing that this one is the Oraita. That's all it's saying. The first one is only the Rabbanan, Lo Yosi. This, a husband, if he becomes deaf or insane, then he cannot divorce at all, olamit, meaning on a deoraita level. That's what olamit is coming to emphasize. It doesn't mean anything necessarily about doing it in writing. It could very well be that he can, in fact, divorce in writing, and that would be another way that we could explain this Mishnah. That would be according to Rashbag, if we did not have the tradition from Rabbi Yochanan, who says that in fact there is a machloket here. We now come to the next Mishnah, but don't forget what Rav Kahana said in the name of Rav. It's going to come at the end of this sugya. Amru lo nichtov get liishtecha, amar lehen ketovu. People come to a person, we're not talking about a deaf person, we're talking about a regular sane person. He may be very sick or on his deathbed, and so he wants to divorce his wife, for example, before he dies. So some people come and say, should we write a get for you? And he says, yes, go ahead and write it. In that case, for sure, those people that he said that to, they themselves can write it and sign it and give it. That's for sure. The problem here is that those two people arrange and ask someone else to do those things. So if those two people that asked in the first place, they go and ask a scribe to write it, and they ask other people to sign it, and they sign it, even if they go ahead and do that and give it to the husband, and the husband himself gives it to the wife, the get is no good, because the husband only authorized those two people to write it and sign it, and that authorization could not be passed on to other people. Ad sheyomad lasofer ketov la'adim hatomu. The only way the husband can authorize anybody is to say directly to the scribe, write it. To those witnesses, sign it. But he cannot pass on agency for those agents to pass on to other people. That is the Mishnah. Ta'ama de lo amar tenu. Ha'amar tenu notnin. Maneh. So now we're going to infer something. Remember this, we'll call this the opening inference. We're going to reject it at the end. So the reason why it's no good in the Resha here is because he only said, write a get for my wife. He didn't say write and give. Right, because it only says write. If there would be, it would be a bigger chidush if he said write and give, and still no good. So therefore, we can infer that if he said write and give a get to my wife, then that would be valid, even though the first agents appointed second agents. Good. Maneh. Now here's the question: who is the author? Rabbi Meir hidamar mile mimseran l'shaliach. Must be Rabbi Meir. He thinks that even just a verbal directive without an item. Remember, we saw that if a husband gives the agent an item like a get, then the agent can appoint another agent. But if there's no physical item, it's just words, according to the Rabbi Meir, the agent can appoint another agent, and that's why it would be good if he said kitvu utnu. The problem is in this Mishnah is he only said kitvu. He didn't say also tenu. So, all right, that looks like the first half of it that works. In the case of Tenu would be to be Meir. The problem is Emasefa ad sheyomad lo sofer ketov v'la'adim hatomu. But the Sefa says the only time it works is if the husband directly told the scribe and the witnesses, write it and sign it. And that suggests that that's the only way it could happen. And even if he said Tenu, it wouldn't work. So, no, it must be this is not a Meir. Atan Rabbi Yosef amar mili lamim saran l'shaliach. See, the Sefa sounds like it's Rabbi Yosef. He says that a verbal directive cannot be delegated to anybody else, and so that's why the husband has to say it directly to whoever is going to write it and whoever is going to sign it, and no language, even tenu, would not work. Now what are we going to do? Resha Rabbi Meir v'Sefa Rabbi Yoseh. So the Resha that says, if he says kitvu utnu, it works. That's Rabbi Meir, who says you can, verbal designation can be passed on. And the Sefa must be Rabbi Meir, that he has to say it directly. Does that make sense? You're going to have two authors in a Braita and a Mishnah, and we say in Resha Rabbi Meir v'Sefa Rabbi Yoseh. We don't really like to say such a thing, but it's possible. Sometimes there is Mishnah or Mishnayot that are mixed like that, and so that is our proposed answer. Number one. Abaye Amar Kula Rabbi Meir. No, Abaye says, I'm going to save the day, and I'll explain the entire Mishnah according to Rabbi Meir. We're talking about a case where he didn't say tenu the whole time. That's why if you're not going to say tenu, then you have to say it directly. But if you said tenu, then that would be fine. But that doesn't read well, because then, you always want the Resha and the Sefa. You want the Sefa to give a chidush, to say something that's important to know. And if you have the Resha that says, if you write kitvu, it's no good, then the better chidush for the Rabbi Meir is that if you say tenu, it is good, right? That would be more interesting than telling us that he has to say it directly, right? So it should say tenu works. So that's not a good reading. Or maybe the problem is that he only told two people, not three. If he tells three people could be a betin, and the betin can go ahead and appoint someone else, and the problem is he only said it to two people, and it still could be the Rabbi Meir. But that also is not a good reading. Then the Sefa should give that chidush. When is it no good? If he said kitvu, it's no good because he said it only to two. But if he said it to three, even though he only said kitvu, that's okay, because he's appointing them a betin, and the betin can authorize someone else to do it. So then you should have said that as the chidush, right? Otherwise, the Mishnah as it reads doesn't really give us any chidush. It just says he has to say it directly, right? Give us a case where it would work, even though they're appointing someone else. So you know what? We abandon this. Abaye, that's all to be Meir. Instead, Ela Kula Rabbi Yosehi. Vacha b'maiskenan delo amar imru. It's all to be Yoseh. And the problem is the husband didn't say to the agent, imru, I authorize you to tell a scribe to write it. And that's why it doesn't work according to Rabbi Yoseh. But we reject this too. If you thought that according to the Rabbi Yoseh, when the husband says imru, he specifically directs the agent that he can retell and a scribe to write it, then the Sefa should have given that distinction. Oh, when is it no good? Because he didn't say imru. But if he says imru, then it would be good. Furthermore, as we saw in a previous daf, Rabbi Yosef does not even agree that an agent can make an agent, not even when he says imru. And we proved it from the following. Ve'od mimo de Rabbi Yosef be'omer imru hatenan. Ketav sofer ve'ayed kasher. Ve'amar Rabbi Yirmiyah hatam sofer shaninu. Does Rabbi Meir think that when the husband says imru, tell the scribe, is it even good? It's not, because the Mishnah teaches, there's a Mishnah coming up in 87b, that if you have a get with ketav sofer, and Yirmiyah explained that ketav sofer doesn't mean that he wrote it, but it means that he actually signed it also, and another witness. So you have a get with the scribe is one of the witnesses, together with another witness, kasher, it's good. Now, Rav Chisda matnitin maneh Rabbi Yosei. Rav Chisda says that the author of this Mishnah is Rabbi Yosei. Damar mili la mimsaran l'shaliach, who says, as we said before, that an agent cannot appoint another agent if it's only words. Okay, now that's all the givens. Now here's the reasoning. If you would think that Rabbi Yosei thinks that imru works and an agent can appoint another agent if the husband says imru, then we're going to have a calamity in this kind of case. In a case where the husband says to two people, I authorize you with imru. He says that phrase imru. You can go and tell a sofer to write it, and to Mr. A and Mr. B to sign it. And if they did that, let's say imru works, and it would be good. But here's the calamity. The problem is that the agent is going to go to the scribe and say, hey, write the get. But he's going to see the agent will be feel bad that, well, you're telling me to write the get, but you're not telling me to sign it? What's wrong with me? Why can't I sign it? So the agent's going to feel bad, and not to embarrass the scribe, is going to say, okay, you can sign it too. The problem is that the husband did not authorize the scribe to sign it. He wanted those other people to sign it. But the agent will do it anyway in order not to embarrass someone, and you'll have a get that looks like it's good, but it's actually not good. And so that would be a calamity. And there's no way that the rabbis would allow a situation that could so easily come to a mistake. Therefore, it must be that, according to the Yosef, who is the author of this Mishnah, Imru doesn't work, and therefore you would never come to a calamity, because the scribe would not sign it unless he heard it from the husband directly. If an agent tried to came and told him, the husband told me imru and told that you should sign it. He said, no, you can't. I can't do that, right? And so no witness would sign something without the husband telling them directly, and that way you would never come to a problem. That's why according to the Mishnah, if you have the scribe as one of the agents and someone else, then we can be sure that it's kosher, that the husband told them directly, and we don't have to worry that it was through an agent and the agent only asked him to do it because he was ashamed, and really the husband didn't ask. We don't have to worry about any of that, because agents never work, not even the case of imru. And therefore, we can prove that according to the Yosef, imru does not work. Therefore, since Rabbi Yosef does not allow an agent to make an agent in any case, the Resha cannot be Rabbi Yosef. Remember, because we made that initial inference that the problem in the Mishnah is because he said kitvu and he didn't say kitvu utnu. But if he said kitvu utnu, it would work. But according to the Yosef, there is no possibility of any kitvu utnu, even if he said imru. An agent cannot make an agent. And so the Resha cannot be the Yosef, because the Yosef will never have a case where it works. Therefore, it must be that the Resha is in fact the Meir, and the Sefa, that he has to say it directly, that's the Yosef, because according to the Meir, there are lots of other ways that a husband can make an agent. And so the Sefa that says he has to say it directly must be the Yosef. So we're back to the drawing board that there's multiple authorship here. But comes to save the day. Rav Asher Amar Kula Rabbi Yosehi Velami Baya Kamar Lami Baya Hecha Delo Amar Tenu Ela Filu Amar Tenu La. Rav Asher says, in fact, the whole Mishnah is the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, who says that a verbal designation cannot be passed on. And even if you say imru, still an agent cannot make an agent. So you can never. So that's the sefa is easy to explain. The husband has to tell people directly. And the resha, remember that inference that we made at the beginning of the sugya? Don't make that inference. This Mishnah is written in not only this, even that style. Not only if he didn't say tenu, he only said kitvu, is it not good? In fact, even if he said kitvu utnu, still the get would not be good if the agents asked other people. And not only if he said only to two people, it wouldn't be good. Even if he told three people, it would not be good. This is all according to the Yosef. Even three people, no good. And that's why the Mishnah doesn't make any such distinction. And not only if he didn't say imru, even if the husband said imru, he said kitvu, utnu, and imru, and in front of three people, still it's not good, and there's no inference to be made in any case where it could possibly be a valid get, and this is all Rabbi Yosef, and that's the style of the Mishnah. Good. Tanya Rabbi Asher, the Rav Asher, Katav Sofer Lishma, וחתמו עדים לשמה, אף על פי שכתבוהו וחתמו ונתנוהו לא ונתנו לה, הרי הגט בטל עד שישמעו קולו, שיאמר לסופר כתוב ולעדים חתומו. Here's a braita, also in the Tosefta, which is even more explicit than the Mishnah, and supports Rav Asher's explanation. If a sofer wrote the get for the sake of this woman, and the witnesses signed it for her sake, even if they wrote it and signed it and gave it to the husband, and the husband gave it to her, which shows that clearly the husband wants it to happen, still it's no good because the husband did not authorize directly those people to do that job. It only works if the scribe hears the voice from the actual husband who says, I want you to write it. And only if the witnesses hear directly from the husband and who tells them, sign it. That's the only possible case that it can work. So you see that any other case, no matter what the formula is, no matter even if it's in front of three people, it's no good. And this is an elaboration on our Mishnah. And so Rav Ashi is supported that the entire Mishnah is the opinion of Rabbi Yosef. Good. Yishme'u lapuke miman de'amar modeh Rabbi Yosef be'omer imru kolo lapuke mid Rav Kahana amar Rav. Now we're going to make a diuk from this Tosefta. When it says here Yishme'u, they actually have to hear it. That word Yishme'u comes to exclude he who says that according to the Biyoseh, that it would be good if he said Imru. That there is an opinion that thinks that according to the Biyoseh, if the husband said, go and tell the scribe to write it, then an agent could make an agent, but that's why it says Yishme'u. No, you have to hear it directly, the husband's own voice. And that shows that the Biyoseh thinks Imru doesn't work. And the word Kolo, his voice, that comes to exclude Rav Kahana Amarav, who we started today with. Rav Kahana, the name of Rav, says if a husband cannot speak, but he's able to write, and he writes a directive to a get should be written for his wife, that's no good. The scribe and the witnesses have to hear it from his voice. He has to say it verbally, and not sufficient to write it, according to this Baraita. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.